we're going to go ahead and move into what's called the Energizer Lab. It's really just an introductory activity into galvanic, or what's also known as voltaic cells and their structure. So we have here in front of us, we have two pieces of what's called mossy zinc. It's just zinc metal, and we have some 0.1 molar copper sulfate. That was copper 2 because of the really bright blue color that it's here in solution. So we're going to go ahead and put one of our pieces of zinc into one of the test tubes just for reference on what it looks like. It's metally, as you can see here, but it's got like a layer of almost chalkiness on the outside, just for reference. And then we're going to go ahead and put like 5 milliliters of our copper sulfate here into the other test tube. There we go. We know now that our zinc will be completely covered by this copper sulfate solution. And we can go ahead and put our piece of zinc in there and record any changes that we see happening over the next few minutes or so. It's been a few minutes, so we're going to go ahead and look at this this zinc piece in the copper solution. So we're going to go ahead and take it out if we can. So the piece on the right is the one that we took out of the copper sulfate solution here. And you can see how it's much darker than the piece on the left, which is still the mossy zinc. Not sure how clear it is on the camera, but it's almost a brownish color. It's definitely darker. There's some hints of reddish and brown in there, versus this one, which is clearly shiny, like silvery metalish. And this one is darker, duller, and almost brownish in some areas, brownish and red. So there you go. That's the first part of this, and the second part we'll be looking at a reaction that has to deal with this. In part 2, we're given this equation. The zinc plus the copper sulfate aqueous solution goes to the copper solid and zinc sulfate in the solution. So we're going to look at this and identify the oxidation and reduction half reactions. So remember that oxidation is loss, oil, so loss of electrons. In order to do that, we should write in charges. The zinc has charge of 0. Copper here has a charge of 2 plus. Sulfate has a charge of 2 minus. Copper again 0. Zinc 2 plus. And 2 minus. So we're looking for a loss of electrons, or in other words, a gain in net charge. So we're going to see here that our oxidation equation is going to be zinc solid going to the zinc ion in solution, 2 plus 2 electrons. I lost 2 electrons in order to get this charge. And similarly, we're going to look for the reduction rate equation, half reaction. And we can see here that it's the other component. Reduction is gain of electrons or a decrease in net charge. So you'll see here that it's copper 2 plus 2 electrons going to solid copper metal. Using this information here, let's try to look to see and compare what we were seeing when we used the zinc piece of metal and the copper sulfate solution. So the thing is that the zinc metal, right, went from being shiny to being in solution in this equation, and the copper sulfate went from being in solution to being solid. So how do we see that? We know copper as a solid is actually that brownish, orangish, reddish color. Here's what copper wiring looks like. You can see clearly that reddish and brownish color. So we're thinking that maybe the copper ended up building up on the outside of the mossy zinc. That would explain the darkish and reddish colors that we were seeing. And that would explain why it's no longer silvery on the outside. That's kind of what we're seeing there, because the copper had to gain the electrons in order to go back to being a solid. The next thing that we'll be doing here is we'll be setting up an actual galvanic cell using these half reactions. So you need a copper strip like this, a zinc strip like this, some 1 molar copper sulfate, as well as some 1 molar zinc sulfate. So we found the initial masses of these two strips here. And the next thing that we could do here is we can go ahead and take a 400 milliliter beaker like this, put one of these porous cups inside of it, and then go ahead and add these solutions. So the zinc sulfate, the one that's clear here, is going to go on the outside of the porous cup. So we'll go ahead and put about 100 milliliters in here. There's our zinc sulfate. And then we can go ahead and pour about 25 milliliters into one of these porous cups, which you'll need a graduated cylinder for. So we got our 25 milliliters of the copper sulfate here, and we can go ahead and put this into the cup, like so, or until the cup goes almost all the way full. Then you can go ahead and move the porous cup into the beaker, like so. And put the zinc strip into the zinc sulfate solution, and the copper strip into the copper sulfate porous cup, like so. So we had masked those strips, those copper and zinc strips, so we have the initial masses. You might want to make predictions based on these half reactions. Which one of them is going to gain mass and which one of them is going to lose mass when we hook them up to a voltmeter. Speaking of which, we need to get our voltmeter up and ready with the red and black things plugged in. Then you want to set it on the 20 volt DC current one over here to the left. And make sure that all of these are hooked up onto the clips, like so. Then you can go ahead and clip these to the pieces of metal, going one for the copper and the other for the zinc strips. You'll notice now that there is a reading between the two. There is current passing through between these two metals. We're going to allow this to continue to run. We're going to allow this to continue to run as we move on to part B. So here you can see that we have a like physical representation of what's going on here in our beaker system here with the voltmeter and the zinc electrode as well as the copper electrode in copper solution and zinc solution. So it's according to these half reactions here. So because of this reaction here, the oxidation reaction, we know that it's the zinc electrode that ends up losing its electrons. So the electrons here are represented by these dots here. So when the cation has the electrodes, it's a solid metal, but when it loses them, it becomes into solution. So what happens in this reaction is that the electrodes or the electrons are lost, and they go through the voltmeter, they come here. This now being a cation goes into solution like that, and then these electrons attach to one of the copper molecules, or sorry, one of the copper atoms in solution, like this. So you can see how it's the copper that ends up gaining mass in this, because the ions in solution are being pulled to be forming more metal on the electrode. Similarly, over here on the left, you can see how the zinc electrode loses mass as the ions go from being solid metal to being in solution. So again, we'll do this again with the next ion here. So the zinc loses its 2 electrons because of the reaction taking place. The electrons go over here and hook onto another one of the copper ions in solution, like that. And the zinc ion goes to being in solution as well. Notice how the sulfates stay where they are. They're not necessarily part of this reaction as much as being necessary for them to be in solution. The other thing to notice here is that in reality, this happens instantaneously. It's not a slow process like we're representing here. It happens pretty instantaneous. After letting the current pass through the system for about 5 to 10 minutes or so, we can go ahead and turn it off and take the clips off of these strips of metal, and then go ahead and dry them off and weigh them. We ended up drying our metal strips and getting some new masses. So the mass of the copper strip here, final, ended up being 2.13 grams, and the mass of the zinc final ended up being 15.95 grams. So again, you can see here how in the reaction that took place in the transfer of electrons, you could see how the copper was gaining the mass while the zinc ended up losing it.